make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Well, Xi Zhongxun saw Catholics in particular as a difficult community to manage because he associated the Vatican with imperialism. And the fact that Catholics are in communion with the Pope, for Xi Zhongxun, this was a very difficult issue to manage because he thought that the nation needed to come first, the party needed to come first. But for Catholics, the most important thing was to be a part of the global community.
Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching us or joining us on our YouTube channel, we're very happy to have you here. I'm your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined, as always, by my trusty sidekick, Pastor Josh Bertram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing well. Make sure you guys smash the like and subscribe button. Smash it like it's with a hammer. Anyway.
All right. There you go. And joining us today, we have with us Joseph Torigian. Did I get that right?
Very close. Closer than most people. Torigian.
Torigian.
Oh, man.
Those Armenian surnames can be tricky, guys.
Where's that? What's the origin of Torigian?
Armenian.
Armenian. All right.
They tend to end in IAN. So now you know the secret about how to tell an Armenian.
Got it. So Joseph Torigian.
Always.
Joseph Torigian. All right. Well, anyway, you are an associate professor at American University and a leading expert on authoritarian regimes, elite politics, and the Chinese Communist Party. And you have a new book called The Party's Interests Come First, The Life of Xi Zhongxun, father of Xi Jinping, offers a deeply researched and revelatory portrait of one of China's most consequential political families. And we're just so glad to have you on our show. Thank you so much for being here, Joseph.
Thank you so much for having me.
Just at the very top, we've already butchered your last name, but I did practice. Xi Zhongxun. Did I say it right?
You are 99% there. Xi Zhongxun.
Dang it.
Xi like the pronoun.
Xi Zhongxun.
Very good. Very good. Yeah. We'll work on the tone some other time.
Yeah.
My tonality is not great.
Well, Joseph, tell us a little bit about why did you write a book about the father of the president of China? It seems like such a obscure topic, but it also implies that you have a lot of information to fill a book about the father of the president of China. So why did you write this book?
So Xi Jinping is one of the most powerful people in the world, but also one of the most mysterious. And my first book taught me how to do research on the Chinese Communist Party. And it's not easy because Xi Jinping has this idea that one of the reasons the Soviet Union collapsed is they lost control of their history. So for Xi Jinping, he really wants people to see their past as one victory to another so that they feel a need to be idealistic and have a sense of conviction about the party's future. So there was this gap for people who wanted to figure out who Xi Jinping was, what he was all about. But I thought the father would be an interesting approach for two reasons. One is that his father was a very powerful revolutionary, a very senior figure in the regime after it was established. And his life is a microcosm for the Chinese Communist Party in the 20th century. And he can tell us so much, not just about how the party works, but also the party's relationship with ethnic minorities such as Tibetans and Uyghurs and Catholics. And for Xi Jinping, he learned about the party through his father. He would have witnessed why his father remained so dedicated to the cause, even though Xi Zhongxun was persecuted by the party on so many occasions. And it raises this interesting question of why Xi Jinping would be so committed to the party, even though his family sacrificed so much for it.
Wow. I think it's amazing when we start to think about and talk about China, because it's not just Xi Jinping, right? That is mysterious, but it feels like to someone like me, maybe many Westerners, especially Americans, China itself is just mysterious. It's like there's this joke that Jim Gaffigan has where he'll go to like he does stuff in like Latin America, and he's like, I could probably get around El Baño, Donde El Baño. He's like, when I go to like China, I'm just gonna die. I know that if I can't tell what anything is, and of course he's being silly and exaggerating, but at that like there is a lot of mystery around it, and I hear all these things about how China is authoritarian. It's communist, and I don't even know what exactly that means. So I would love if you would level set and just help us understand, maybe even over the like from 1950 now. You don't have to go into huge detail, just enough to give us a sense. Like, how did China, like, how authoritarian is it, and how did it get there to where? Like, what are we really talking about when we're talking about Chinese communism and authoritarianism?
Well, one thing to say to Jim Gaffigan is that Chinese people are lovely and very friendly. And if you went, they would be very kind to him. And I think that he would enjoy the trip. And, what's interesting, China is a mysterious place, even for Chinese people, in the sense that for elite politics, it's not just outsiders who find it very hard to figure out what's going on, but even people at the very top often are unsure about what is really transpiring. And when Xi Jinping became the top leader in 2012, many people thought that he would be like their understanding of who his father was, a reformer, a humane leader, somebody who would push China into a more open direction. And they were very surprised. So this isn't a case of dumb Westerners not being able to figure out this country. Even for people at the very top, it's a very confusing place because there's so many rumors and so many reasons for people to mischaracterize their thinking. And so when you ask about how authoritarian is China really, if we look at the country's past over the last few decades, it kind of depends a little bit on what year we're talking about. But when we think about the party and its organizational principles, it is built to enforce discipline. It is built based on the idea that to achieve extraordinarily ambitious goals, you have to be able to convince people to put their own thoughts to the side, to put their own interests aside, and put, as the title of my book says, the party's interests first. And I think Xi Jinping, when he came to power, thought the party was departing from those revolutionary legacies of this enthusiasm and discipline, and he's trying to re-inspire that.
I'm curious. I've got two questions. One easier, one longer. Both the father and the sons. Is it their first name? Is it Xi?
Xi is their family name, is their surname.
Got it. Okay, so
it goes first in that culture. Is that the idea?
The family name is Xi, correct? So that goes first.
Interesting.
Exactly.
Okay,
exactly.
That makes sense. And like when you're talking about, putting the party first, like can you westernize that for somebody that may have only an understanding of liberal democratic or constitutional republic type of like government? Like what is being a part of the Communist Party like mean there in China?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Lenin said that the Communist Party is a party of a different type. It's not like political parties in the West. In the West, the ideal is that you find other people with whom you have similar ideas, and in a system of free exchange, you work together and you form a coalition. You can leave it when you want to. You can argue with people. If the person who leads the party is pursuing an agenda that you disagree with, you can say that. You can tell the head of your party that you want them to change their mind. You can always join another party. You can hold some political views, but not others. But a Leninist party is based on fundamentally different principles. It's based on this idea that you have a core leader who is firewalled from concerns of what's popular and what's not, because that allows the person to tell people to do really scary things or do things that could put them in harm's way, and also target people who may be a threat to him. And so when you are a conspiratorial organization working underground and you need to kill people, you need to hide, you need to engage in subterfuge, you need to have this very top-down, leader-friendly system. And of course, when you have a leader that powerful, they often make choices that other people don't think are right or that they disagree with. But the party is built so that you can force people to do that. And even at the most extreme, conclude that when you differ with the leader, there's something wrong with you. That's the problem. You're not keeping up. And that the leader is wise, and therefore you need to figure out what they want. That's much more important than figuring out what it is that you want.
So how is it that revolution happens then in a system that essentially is like what you said? Like, how does change occur in a system where, and maybe like even tying it to your book with Xi Jinping's father, and can you say his name again? I'm sorry, so I can know how to pronounce it.
Yeah, Xi Zhongxun.
Xi Zhongxun. Like, how was he able to kind of be a revolutionary within this party when there's such respect for leadership and how you're not following? If I'm understanding correctly, how is that? What happened there?
Josh, we park in the same garage because what you were speaking to is the central puzzle of my book, which is how a human being in such a leader-friendly system, in what some people have called an organizational weapon, how you balance the needs of the system with your own humanity and your own views. And the story of his life is how he struggled to find an answer. And so often he agreed with what the party was doing. Often he did not. And often when he was forced to make a decision he didn't want to, he felt guilty about it. It was deeply stressful. When he was persecuted, and this is very counterintuitive, but it actually rededicated his sense of mission and cause because he wanted to prove to the party once again that he was worthwhile, that he believed in its mission and that he deserved respect. And so it's not, oh, you're being mean to me. Why do I give this organization my time? Why should I sacrifice for it? It's, oh, they don't trust me. How do I work even harder to win back that trust? That's how he thinks. And so you're right. So if you're in if you're in a system where the leader is so powerful, what happens when you need to course correct? What happens when something is going wrong? And that is a central question, right? Because if you are the deputy, if you are the person working for the top leader, and you're told to go achieve some goal and the goal isn't working, it's failing, how do you go to the top leader and tell them that without threatening them or making it seem like the leader had made a mistake? And so you saw constantly throughout the history of the People's Republic of China them not being able to manage that. And this feeds into another question, which is succession, right? Because these deputies, you're looking at them as possible candidates for who will become the next leader. And if they're not getting it, and in fact, they're complaining to you saying that their agenda as set is not functioning, that's a problem. So you have to really say something like, oh, generally things are going well. You are so wise. You've put us on the right path. But in implementation, maybe we can do some things better. But even that is not easy to do right. It requires a lot of skill. It requires a lot of trust. And these leaders, even though they're so powerful, and this is another puzzle, are still paranoid and still constantly looking for challenges to them.
You know, with Xi Jinping being the president, or is that the right title, president, or
that's the formal title as they translate it into English, correct?
Got it. So like was his leadership or his like move into leadership like a foregone conclusion as being the son, or was there another path? And maybe kind of bonus question is like, does he have any brothers or sisters that could have equally been chosen?
I mean, this is such an interesting question, right? Like, how much does it matter for Xi Jinping's career that his father was such a leading figure? And unsurprisingly, it certainly helped him, but only in some ways, and in many ways it hurt him. And in fact, when someone asked Xi Jinping what his family background meant for his career, you know what Xi Jinping said? He said, it's not what people think. Actually, being the son of Xi Zhongxun taught me the fickleness of human relationships. It taught me how people could be persecuted. Wow. It taught me that it's not all just applause. So he's saying that actually I suffered because of who my father was, not benefited. And in some sense, that's true, because Xi Zhongxun, the father, was persecuted in 1962, which was several years before the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. And Xi Jinping said that he suffered more than most when he was a child because of how his father was treated. And then in the 1980s, the party is trying to figure out who the new successor generation is going to be. And they look to their own children because they trust them, right? But the problem is that these so-called princelings are not popular because of this sense of nepotism, this sense of that they're benefiting in a way that they don't deserve. So that was a problem for Xi Jinping's career, even as his father, at least occasionally, even directly tried to intervene, and that could really backfire. So I think for Xi Jinping, he probably feels a sense of entitlement because of his father was, but also a sense of vulnerability because he fears that people look down on him because they think that he's only there because of who his father was. And I'm sure that's something that he doesn't like.
This is so wild. And I'm curious about, like how I don't even know how to ask this question. Like when you go to therapy, they're always asking you about, mommy, daddy issues. Like, and we all have them, right? Like, and Xi Jinping is no different, it sounds like. So, I mean, like, as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, like, is this something the presidents normally know? So they know, like, not to step on certain hot button topics or, just to have a little insight about the brain of another world leader. I'm curious, like, what's your take on how this information is being used? Because everything you just said makes perfect sense. And I'm just thinking, man, like, I'd love for somebody in the State Department to at least know the father of the person of the largest economy.
Yeah. So psychology and history are different disciplines for a reason. Neither one can be reduced to the other, but you can learn a lot about history with psychology. You learn about psychology with history. So I don't want to say that I can tell you what Xi Jinping is going to do tomorrow because of what the household was like when he was a child. But to get a sense of his worldview, how he thinks about China's future, how he thinks about its past, how he thinks about how the party works, but also just to use the past to forecast the future. Now, that doesn't say to predict the future. What forecasting allows you to do is ask what these leaders are facing, ask what it is they worry about. And that gives us the ability to look at the evidence that's available, and it's very limited, with an interpretive lens of what makes sense given what we know has happened in the past.
So, and I know, like, if you don't mind, I mean, I know we're talking about Xi Zhongxun. I'm sure I'm butchering it every time. It's okay.
Getting better, actually.
I think people know. Yeah, nice, good. But there's this sense, right, whenever I talk to a lot of people in conservative circles, that China is the enemy, right? And yet we're so connected to them economically, and yet it's like they're the enemy. Like, I guess I would love to hear from you. How much concern should the average American have? I know it's a hard question to answer, but just in your opinion, how much concern should the average American have about China and its ascendancy or its rise, like its goals and their ambitions? Like, is this something to be feared? Is it something just to be understood? Is it a mixture? Like, especially given what you know about Xi Jinping from this study, what do you think about that?
We as a country are at a moment where we need to figure out a very difficult question, which is how to compete with China without turning the relationship completely overboard, and how to work with China without allowing them to hurt our interests. And that is an exceedingly difficult balance to get right. It's the kind of balance that we pursued with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, where sometimes détente was possible, sometimes peaceful coexistence was possible, and sometimes we were having very dangerous moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis. So for people in Washington, I think what they're trying to understand is how we can protect supply chains, how we can develop relationships with allies in East Asia, but also not make the relationship so conflictual that we can't work with them on anything, and in a more dangerous situation, even risk a war. And that's what we are trying to figure out. And this isn't just a game of strategy for people in Beijing and Washington, because how we address these challenges will have huge implications for who we are as a society, and how open we are, and how closed we are, and how we balance who we are as a country with what I think are real threats, and how we characterize them as the political process that we're going through right now.
Yeah, can you talk to us a little bit about Xi Zhongxun's reign, when he came into power? What was going on in the world? What was sort of the big crisis that he was having to navigate, and then how did the rest of his, I don't know, time in office, that doesn't sound right, his rule, how did the rest of it go?
Yeah, so he was from the northwest of the country, which was particularly poor. And it was a very dramatic place for him to grow up, because he was born in a village near Xi'an, which you may have heard of. That's where the terracotta soldiers are. And the reason they're there is that's where the first Chinese emperor formed the first state. And for millennia, the dynasties weren't in Beijing, they were in Xi'an. But by the time Xi Zhongxun was born, it had gone through years of war and banditry and famine. So it was a very radical milieu, right? And he joined the party very young, at 15 years old. And his career stands out because he held very weighty positions at very tender ages. So in 1945, there was this very big Congress, very important party Congress, and he was the youngest candidate member to the Central Committee. And he was the youngest vice premier in 1959. So he's constantly witness to these very significant moments in Chinese history. He was there for the Great Leap Forward. He was kidnapped by Red Guards at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution and brought to another city and confined in a dormitory. And then when he's released from power, he is the party boss of Guangdong province. Now, that's a very interesting place to be in the early years of reform, because the special economic zones, the most famous physical manifestation of China's new relationship with the outside world, was in Guangdong, and they were started when he was there. And then in the 1980s, he goes back to Beijing, and he's working for the Secretariat. And this is a body that is essentially the party's brain. And he's running all of these really interesting areas like Tibetan affairs, Xinjiang, ideology, relations with foreign leftist, communist, and revolutionary parties. And then during that decade as well, he's witness to even more power struggles at the very top of the elite.
And what year period are we talking about when he's
so between 1952 to 1962. He's in Beijing working for a man named Zhou Enlai, the premier, who's well known outside of China as well. And then he's persecuted for 16 years. That's a long time. He is humiliated. He's incarcerated. He's exiled. And then he's working in Guangdong, 1978 to 1980. And then he works for the Secretariat in Beijing for much of the 1980s. He plays an interesting role during June 4, the crackdown in Tiananmen Square, which we can talk about. And it's shortly after that he spends most of the 1990s in a sort of semi-exile in the South, because he's had a falling out with the leadership.
Interesting. So when was Xi Jinping born?
1953, and that's an interesting year, because that year Xi Zhongxun was the Minister of Propaganda, and the number one slogan was "The Soviet Union of today is China's tomorrow." So it was a moment where China was really quite close to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So I want to think about, just for a moment, just looking at you were able, you mentioned that rather, you mentioned that the evidence is very scant. And some of this stuff, it's hard to find some of it. It's archival materials, interviews, party documents, things like that. And you were able to get connected to those. I would love to hear as much as you can how you're able to get access to these things.
Yeah.
And then what if there's anything that you saw that kind of made you feel like any story or any document that was particularly revelatory to you for Xi Jinping or Xi Zhongxun?
Yeah. So I could write a book about the writing of the book that's even longer than the biography itself. So I'll have to be careful. And if I go on, you can give me a hand signal or something. But it was 9 or 10 year process of writing this book. It's 700 pages. I tried to write it for popular audiences, so don't let that scare people away. But, it's not the kind of regime where you can go to one archive and collect a bunch of materials and then write up what you see. You need to have kind of a detective sensibility. You need to be sensitive to possibilities, not limitations. You need to be open to any kind of evidence. I don't think in terms of good and bad evidence. I think of getting as much evidence as possible and then parsing it in different ways and using it to make a mosaic. And some things are more detailed and some things are not. And even my book, it's a draft of history. It can only be a draft of history. And I had a professor who once told me that someone from China criticized him for getting something wrong. And this professor said, of course I got it wrong. I didn't know about it. It was just a very humble way of thinking about the past is continuously changing as we learn more. You asked me earlier about how authoritarian China is, and I said that it changes, right? And there was a brief period of time where it was extremely exciting to be doing research on Chinese history. And one reason was that these archival materials were available, and some of it actually ended up in American libraries. And that is, firsthand account. It's actual archival evidence. In Hong Kong, historians, but also previous leaders in the regime would publish books outside of censorship in the mainland. And even in the mainland, there were these party history journals that were really pushing the envelope and talking about the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, these tragic moments in Chinese history. I could go to China and conduct interviews. But also what I did to try to be creative was I made a list of every time Xi Zhongxun met a foreigner. And then I would go and interview them, or I would go to their archive. So for example, in the 1980s, Xi Zhongxun, the father of Xi Jinping, was in charge of these negotiations between Beijing and the Dalai Lama's emissaries from Dharamsala. And I was able to get the Tibetan language transcripts of those conversations, as well as interview the Dalai Lama, to try to get the story right of how Beijing's relationship with Tibetans evolved over time. And, each little thing is a new wrinkle. Each little thing is a new detail. And then when you do it long enough and you put it all together. The last thing I'll say too is here at the Hoover Archives at Stanford University, this man named Li Rui, who was a former secretary to Mao Zedong and was a good friend of Xi Zhongxun, another senior revolutionary, he donated his diaries. And they are extremely detailed, and they talk about all of these new things that would have made it impossible for me to write my book. So, and finally, just time, to allow accidents to happen. And it's almost like farming in a way, I feel. You kind of are sensitive to a topic, and then things emerge and grow. One piece of evidence in particular was really a big deal for me. I found these memoirs of a Taiwanese spy master. He ran espionage for Taipei against mainland China. And this guy actually had been a member of the Chinese Communist Party before he defected and worked for the nationalists who then ran off to Taiwan and had been a childhood friend of Xi Zhongxun. And in the late 1980s, early 1980s, Xi Zhongxun reaches out to him and tries to use him as a secret back channel for negotiations to possibly facilitate unification. So that was a really exciting thing to see, to put that story together. This cloak and dagger stuff.
Dude, that's really cool. Did I hear you say that you interviewed the Dalai Lama?
I did. I tried to get an interview for 6 or 7 years, and they finally said yes. You can put you in touch. I know that you think about themes that he's interested in. So, yeah. But no, it took me years and years, and it finally happened. And I'm glad it happened because he was such a witness to history, and he knew the father. And so I wanted to try to get the story right, and the story of Tibet is a very important story to get right for people to know about. So,
yeah, that's awesome. So I want to switch gears a little bit because you and I have a mutual friend that suggested you come on our show because you may have some information about kind of the faith environment that was present during his reign. So I'd love for you to kind of just kind of help unpack this, because I think to our audience especially, this part probably is the wildest or weirdest, because like most of what Western Americans know about China is very little, and we know even more, or we know even less about sort of the religious environment unless you're connected to the missionary fields that happen to be working there. So I'd love for you just to kind of unpack that for us.
Well, I think it speaks to your question in two ways. One is what communism meant for Xi Zhongxun as the source of purpose in his life. And there was something very interesting that kept happening to me when I would give talks about Xi Zhongxun, and I would talk about how when he suffered at the hands of the party, he saw this as a redemptive experience, and he saw this as an opportunity to forge. He keeps using this imagery of forging when the party is persecuting him. And in this Bolshevik political culture, there's this idea that when you go through these emotionally devastating experiences, it actually makes your belief stronger and allows you to show that even when you go through that you are still loyal to the cause. And occasionally people would go up to me after and said, I went to Catholic school, and this is something that's somewhat familiar to me, even though I'm talking about a communist, right? And there's this story that Xi Jinping tells about how when he was exiled to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution and was searching for meaning in his life and was feeling disillusioned by all of the ways the Cultural Revolution had proven to be a disaster, he read this novel by a Russian revolutionary called What Is to Be Done. And it has this character who's a professional revolutionary who would sleep on a bed of nails to toughen up his will and make him a better communist. And Xi Jinping said, when I read this, I used to walk around in the wind and the rain and the snow with a shirt off, and I would sleep on a hot stone bed to make myself a better communist, a tougher person, right? And so it sort of sounds like the hair shirt, which maybe you guys have heard of, right? That these monks used to put on to be physically uncomfortable because somehow it contributed to their spiritual life. Now, I don't want to go too far in this direction, right? Because the gospel is a message of love, and the Communist Party, especially during the Mao era, was a message of class struggle. Nevertheless, there are familiar themes maybe that on the one hand sound very foreign and different, but perhaps when we think about it more and we try to use radical empathy to get into the heads of these people to better understand them, right? So in that sense, that's very interesting, right? Because he is going through this search for meaning, but he's also dealing with these ethnic and religious minorities in China who have their own approach to purpose in their lives. And in the 1950s and the 1980s, that includes Catholics as well as Protestants. Catholics were a bigger problem for him. That's his words, not me, not mine. And also, as I said, the Tibetans, but the Uyghurs as well. So Islam was something he thought about too. But because Christianity was from outside of China, it was seen as a unique challenge for the regime.
So how has the regime handled Christianity throughout the years? Like, say, for the last, I guess, one clarifying question, just real quick. Xi Zhongxun, what's the highest rank that he got? Was he ever the president?
No. So his highest rank was member of the Politburo. And in the 1980s, he was the guy who ran the daily affairs of the Secretariat, which is sort of the body within the party elite that managed what needed to be done to keep everything going. Not coming up with the big ideas, but implementation. But implementation was huge, right? Because the top leader would say, you need to do this, but you also need to do that, wouldn't say exactly how to do it. And also you needed to make a hash of it. You couldn't make a hash of it, but you also couldn't lose the faith of the top leader who had their own views, and they often changed their mind. So it wasn't this kind of thing where you would just do what the top leader said. There was all of these things that you needed to consider, both just the nature of the challenge, but also your relationship with the top leader and how getting that wrong could be very dangerous for you.
I just want to say something just real fast, because you invoke the term Politburo. Politburo.
Politburo.
And it's the same term. If you haven't read the Jake Tapper, Alex Thompson book about Biden, like there's sort of a small kind of like set of group of people that were kind of in charge of information control about Biden, and they were called the Politburo, and I never understood it. And like I googled it, and it said something about Chinese Communist group.
Did they call themselves the Politburo, or did Jake Tapper call them the Politburo?
Yeah, it's spelled exactly the same way as it's pronounced. So yeah, it's kind of weird. Anyways, that's a fun fact. Sorry, Josh, I didn't mean to cut you.
No, that's fine. I appreciate that. I was just confused. I was getting confused for a minute. But okay, so he was very high up in the rankings.
But not the very top.
Not the very top. Gotcha. And so how did China like deal with Christianity, and how is someone like Xi Zhongxun, how did he like how did he treat them? Like, I know that you're saying he kind of wrestled with it, wrestled with these different religions, but what was his final stance? And I guess following that, I know they're all kind of related, was how has that, do you think, influenced Xi Jinping's position towards Christianity?
Well, Xi Zhongxun saw Catholics in particular as a difficult community to manage because he associated the Vatican with imperialism. And the fact that Catholics are in communion with the Pope, for Xi Zhongxun, this was a very difficult issue to manage because he thought that the nation needed to come first, the party needed to come first. But for Catholics, the most important thing was to be a part of the global community, right? And so he's trying to figure out how to go about this. And what's so interesting is during the 1950s, he has both a very tough side to him, but also a very flexible and practical side. And so he is moving gradually to try to separate the Catholics from the Vatican. He's trying to figure out how to do that without driving them underground or driving them into open resistance against Beijing. And so on the one hand, he's telling that the Catholics that they need to be sure that they're pious and devoted so that they don't lose the faith of the flock. But on the other hand, if they're too pious, then he doesn't trust them, right? So he wants them to be good interlocutors for party power, but he also worries about whether or not they're actually loyal to the regime. And so you see him reflecting and understanding of how explosive this issue is, but also him talking about the Pope in these rather apocalyptic terms as someone who is dangerous to Chinese interests, right? And so in the 60s and 70s, the church is persecuted to an extraordinary extent. Churches are destroyed. People are not allowed to practice their faith openly. And then in the 1980s, the party is trying to figure out how to put the pieces back together and bring religion into the open so it can be better controlled, to use an alliance with Catholics to pursue economic modernization. But they're trying also to figure out, you have this official church, right, which is broken with the Vatican, but now you also have this underground church as well. And the party is shocked that even after the Cultural Revolution, people find so much meaning in Catholicism. And in fact, partly because they were persecuted, now the society is opening up. They really double down on it. And of course, this is also a period where people are losing faith in communism, right? Because the Cultural Revolution was such a disaster. So people don't know what to believe anymore. So the numbers of people who are going to church are exploding, and often they're going to the underground churches, right? Not the officially approved Catholic organization that Beijing helped create, that Xi Zhongxun helped create during the 1950s. And so it's interesting. Xi Zhongxun ultimately selects this new Catholic leader, who's a very curious figure because he talks about himself as stuck in between the party and the Vatican. And he tries to work with both at the same time. And some people say he's actually a communist, and some people say he's actually loyal to the Vatican. And he's a very complicated figure. There's a Jesuit priest named Mariani who's coming out with a biography of this guy. I recommend you speak to him as well. But it just speaks to how to be a Christian in an authoritarian nation. On the one hand, you find a lot of power in your faith, and you want to pursue your own conscience, but you also want to protect your flock, and you have to ask whether you going to jail is better than you working with the regime to try to find some kind of condominium. And so it's interesting because in some ways it parallels Xi Zhongxun's own dilemma, which is how to be loyal to an organization that sometimes persecutes you, that sometimes you disagree with what it's doing. And so my book at heart is kind of a dilemma of how you manage these kinds of perennial challenges that we face as members of society, which are sort of brought to a more extreme level in a place like China.
How has Xi Jinping how has his policy been towards Christianity, and how do you feel like that was influenced by his dad?
Yeah. So it's certainly the case that he has adopted a more hardline perspective in some ways, right? So the 1980s, when Xi Zhongxun was running religious affairs, lots of people see that as a period of failed experimentation. And the idea here is that when you let up, when you give space, when you don't repress people, you don't actually win them over. They just take advantage of you, right? And so the regime under Xi Jinping, they're worried about a lot of outward manifestations of religion. So there was this campaign of to take down crosses, for example, in one province. What's interesting is many of the lawyers who are rights defenders, they find a lot of strength in their faith. There's a lot of them are Christians, and they see Christianity as an answer to how not only to resist the regime in a peaceful way, but how to not lose faith in yourself. And so that makes it very interesting and surprising that it's under Xi Jinping that there was this condominium that was achieved with the Vatican, right? And so much of it is mysterious. I can't tell you what it is because I don't know what is actually in the document. But you can kind of see Xi Jinping probably feeling that he achieved what his father could not, which is finally reaching a deal with the Vatican that allows him to say that this problem that his father had faced since the early 1950s under his rule, he was able to find a solution to, at least temporary.
Yeah, when you say condominium, like are we talking about the same kind of like condominium that I don't know, like rich people have?
I mean, an agreement. Maybe that's an easier term. I'm talking about this idea that the official church, the open church, these when you go to their mass now, it's considered by the Vatican to be legitimate, essentially. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I was a little confused there, but I am curious if we can just switch gears here just for a second, because you're somebody that's fluent in both Chinese and Russian. You study authoritarian strategies. Like I curious if you see any parallels in today's sort of news cycle, if you will, like between like the logic that Xi Jinping is using and Putin is using to achieve world domination. I don't really know, like just achieve like their objectives.
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah. Because President Putin, President Xi Jinping, I think equally have bigger ambitions. Whether Putin, it's Ukraine, China, maybe Taiwan, and given your expertise in sort of both areas, I'd love for you just to kind of opine on what similarities do you see, each leader kind of capitalizing on.
That's a terrific question. So they're similar in such striking ways. They're both born in 1953. They both come from families that served the regime. They both witnessed periods of humiliation. They both see the West as implacably opposed to their countries reaching the rightful place in the world. They both see the United States as using history, negative views of their past to undermine them. They both believe that the United States is using peaceful evolution to destroy the regime. So what's peaceful evolution? Well, it's this idea that capitalists are too frightened of war to use force to destroy Russia and China. So what they do is fight battles without gunpowder, which is another way of saying winning over the youth with materialist values and consumerist values and a belief that the West is better. And even their legitimation narratives for why they're in power are kind of similar, right? So Putin talks about the 1990s as a period of chaos when the country was falling apart, and that he came and put everything back together. And Xi Jinping says that there were these forces emerging in Chinese society that the party couldn't control. They had views of the West that were very dangerous, and he was able to reimpose this sense of discipline and conviction on the party that allowed him to turn things around. So together they have this view that this American belief that there was only one direction to history and it ended in liberal democracy is wrong, and that they have been able to show the world that there is a Russian form of modernization, a Chinese form of modernization, and that this is a way for other countries to recognize that they can do that too, and they don't need to do what the West tells them to do. And they have this very dramatic language. They talk about achieving changes that haven't been seen for a century, and it's rather breathtaking, actually, the way that they talk about that together.
Yeah, well, what is fascinating to me is everything that you've explained about Xi Jinping's father, and even Xi Jinping to a degree, growing up as a young boy and kind of feeling like he's got something to prove to the world because, everyone thinks he's where he's at because of nepotism. If you read Fiona Hill's book about Putin, like he kind of has a similar like upbringing, like, born in the courtyard, I think is what it's called, or I forgot, but it's like an area where all the kids commune, play, as their parents are off working at the factory or whatnot.
Xi Jinping grew up in this so-called courtyard culture too.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Oh, that's so wild. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that, especially for those that maybe haven't read like the Fiona Hill book about Putin?
Yeah. So,
like, what is courtyard culture?
Yeah, courtyard culture. It's funny, actually. I was listening to a podcast between two Chinese people who were talking about my book yesterday. And one of them said, somebody should write a book about courtyard culture. And now you're asking me about it. So I'm kind of chuckling a little bit. So Xi Jinping grew up basically in a leadership compound, right? And so this was a situation where their parents were working insane hours, right? The regime had just been established. They're hardly getting any sleep. It's an electric environment. They're very excited. And the children, they have a lot of time on their own. And then, of course, in 1962, Xi Jinping's father is removed from the leadership, and he is sent to essentially solitary confinement. So he can't watch over the kids. So the kids have even more freedom. And when the Cultural Revolution started, there weren't any adults at all, really. And so Xi Jinping formed like a little group of kids, like some toughs who would like wander around and get into these fights and hit each other with belts and this kind of thing. And it was rather Hobbesian, right? And Xi Jinping was incarcerated. He was subjected to struggle sessions. He's still a teenager, right? And so in 1969, he's exiled to the countryside. And according to his own account, he's boarding this train to go to the middle of nowhere. And everyone else is crying and he's smiling. And one of his siblings asks him, "Why are you smiling?" He says, "Because there's nothing for me here," right? It's these street battles, incarceration. And that's a tough place to grow up in, right? And then he goes to the countryside, a very poor area. He admits that he's not tough enough for it. He flees back to the capital on one occasion. He can't get along with the peasants. The physical labor is something that he can't handle. And later on, he would say, I became tougher than anyone because of that. Like anybody who goes through that, there's nothing else that can face them. And so at least that's the story that he tells about himself.
I would love, and this is actually my last question, but what is the cost of ignorance of China and ignorance of these leaders and their history, especially these authoritarian leaders? What's the cost of not understanding their motivations and ignorance about their culture, like for the West? And maybe if you have examples that you could bring, or just kind of your intuition and part of your research, like what is the cost? Another way to say it, how important is it for our leaders and, for the normal person, but especially our leaders, to be informed culturally and about these leaders?
You're asking a very timely question, because when I was learning Chinese, when I was going to China to travel and study, it was much easier. And because of the political relationship, because of COVID, because of China's reputation, because of a whole host of limitations, it's harder for Americans to go to China to learn, especially if you're working on sensitive topics. And now it looks like in the future, it will also be hard for Chinese people to come here to study because of this review of visas for Chinese students. And the question that emerges is, what does that mean for how we as a society understand China, and does it really matter? And I think it absolutely matters, because the relationship between China and the United States won't just define who we are, who Chinese people are, but the rest of the world too will be affected by whether or not we get it right. And getting it right requires a sensitivity to how the system works and how the people who lead the system think. And so my book is not something where it will tell you when Xi Jinping will call Donald Trump to talk about tariffs. It won't tell you how the negotiations are going to go. You need to have a sensitivity to the specifics of any situation. But at the same time, if you have a broader context, it allows you to interpret the evidence we do have in a way that's better. And if it allows us to make a better choice, then that's better for everyone.
I'm curious on what do you hope readers will walk away with after they read your book about. Hold on, just a little insider baseball. I wrote his dad's name, Xi Zhongxun, phonetically. And like every time I reference it, I keep forgetting where I put it. It's like at the top of my notes. So
you just say Papa Xi maybe is easier.
Thank you. Yeah, that. So what do you hope people take from your work that you've invested, so many years on? I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Well, one thing, I think that there's an intrinsic value to history. It doesn't need to be purposeful. It doesn't need to be instrumental. And especially in my book, where there's so much suffering and so many people lost their lives, I think that their story needs to be told for the sake of their story being told. I think that my book is useful for helping people understand authoritarian politics, understanding China today, which I think the public mindedness there is present to help facilitate decisions. But the last thing I want to say is it's, in a way, a book about human suffering and how people bring meaning to it. And that, in a way, how Xi Jinping thinks about the world is rooted in what his family went through. And I don't want to tell people what they should think when they read that. So I consider my work as doing my best to get the story right. There is an interpretive lens. I have my own thoughts. But the party tells you how to feel about history and how to understand history. I don't. So I just want people to read the book, and whatever they think about the people in it, who I've tried to do justice to, they can draw their own conclusions.
That's awesome. Where can people follow your work and kind of learn about what you're studying next?
Twitter and Blue Sky would be good places to start. Thank you.
That's awesome. And your book can be found in all the book places?
It can.
Okay, good.
And actually, I had a little piece of news today. It's June 5th. I'm not sure when this will come out, but there's only 2 copies left at Amazon. So,
oh my gosh!
If you want it, for if people want it
That's
for
great.
a Father's Day gift, TikTok.
Yeah.
So.
That's right. And if it's past June 5th, you can probably still order it wherever you get the books things. But well, anyway, thanks so much for coming on the show, Joseph. This has been amazing. Love talking with you. And yeah, just really appreciate all the work that you've been doing.
Well, I hope you thought that it was useful and interesting. You can tell I like to talk about it, and I hope your listeners enjoyed hearing about it.
We did, and we know that they did as well. And yeah, just thank you again. So, and to our audience, thank you so much for stopping by to check out what we're doing. Make sure you like and subscribe, do all that fun stuff. And as always, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Hey there, Josh Bertram here, faithful host of the Faithful Politics Podcast. I want to let you know about a compelling new spinoff, the Faith Roundtable, where I'll be interviewing top faith leaders, theologians, and scholars to unpack the pressing issues that are shaping the church in America today. We'll dive into topics like faith in public life, social justice, and how we can engage our communities more effectively. Make sure you don't miss any of our enlightening conversations by subscribing to it on our YouTube channel. Join me at the Faith Roundtable, where deep discussion meets thoughtful insight.